introduce the next speaker is a lady that's been to the forefront of the pro-life cause for a long time. She's a qualified solicitor, and she's now going to speak to us on the whole pro-life campaign. So please put your hands together for Caroline Simons.
Good afternoon, everybody. Well, that's some morning, isn't it? I mean, how can I follow people like Ralph Martin, Magnus MacFarlane Barrow, and Father Tim? Doesn't it just show you we all can do something? We all have some part to play, and some people are called to do magnificent things. And we really should keep all of these people in our prayers, as we should keep all of each other. Anyway, it's a while since I've seen you all, and maybe you don't follow all the debates that go on in the news about abortion in Ireland as closely as I have to. It is a bit of a drag sometimes, and the detail can take up an awful lot of your time. So I'm here today just to let you know where things are now, how different things have become in the last year or two, and what we're going to be looking at before the Pope might come to Ireland in August. We've heard an awful lot over the last few weeks about politicians looking into their hearts and having evolving positions and going on journeys that somehow seem to bring them all to exactly the same place in relation to abortion. They're all the rage. We've been told that there's a new middle ground and that the government's proposed abortion referendum and the legislation that they suggest they will give to us after the repeal, if it happens, will reflect the middle ground, that people like you and me are extreme. But no matter how they package it, spin it, or present it, the government's referendum proposal to dismantle the Eighth Amendment is about one thing and one thing only, and that is introducing abortion on demand. Fact. The referendum proposal as it stands intends to move all, literally all, constitutional protection from all, literally all unborn babies up to 12 weeks. Another fact, the proposed legislation intends to allow abortion on vague and undefined health grounds. Some pro-abortion advocates have suggested that well-being is what health will mean in this context, and we know how many abortions take place in the UK on the grounds of these vague health issues. 97%, I understand, of nearly 200,000 babies every year. Another fact, since the politicians haven't exactly used them up themselves in recent weeks. If the referendum, which will most likely happen at the end of May, were to pass, there would be nothing, literally nothing, that could stop a future Dáil from voting away any remaining legal protections for unborn babies in the event that the legislation they bring in has a few restrictions in it in the first round. We hear about the journeys, and we hear about the fact that politicians have somehow changed their mind since the 2013 legislation and now see the need for more abortion. We're meant to believe that they all travelled the exact same road on these journeys, that they asked exactly the same questions, that they agonised on the same points, and somehow that they all reached identical conclusions. I don't mean to disrespect our politicians, but I simply don't buy it. Our political leaders are displaying their weakness, not the leadership we expect of them. There's no more important right than the right to life. It's very sad to see some of our leading politicians abandoning this most basic of human rights instead of taking a stand for the most vulnerable and defenceless members of our human family. Unborn babies, more than anyone else, need our love and our solidarity to ensure that they are protected in our law and welcomed in our lives. Some of our political leaders claim that the Eighth Amendment hasn't stopped abortions from happening, and therefore we should vote for repeal. But this argument ignores the fact that the Eighth Amendment has contributed hugely to our abortion rates being vastly lower than they are in other countries where abortion is freely available, for instance in the UK. There are few laws that we can say with absolute certainty save lives. The Eighth Amendment is one of those laws. There are people alive in this country today because of the Eighth Amendment. They aren't mere statistics, but they are living, breathing people that you know, that we all know personally, and some of them have told us that this is how they have come to exist. When I'm in the company of friends whose son or daughter was nearly aborted, I'm not meeting a choice. I'm meeting a child with the same potential and the same right to be alive as everyone in this room today. One of the things that was missing from the journeys of the politicians are the stories of families who say that they owe the life of their child to the existence of the Eighth Amendment in our laws. Incredible stories. Stories that have been blanked out by some of these leaders. And then, I don't know if any of you noticed recently the attempt of some politicians to try and shut down debate about the number of babies diagnosed with Down syndrome who are aborted in countries where abortion is legal. We weren't allowed to talk about that. I was very impressed to see a woman called Patricia Traynor on the television saying to the media, "I will not be told what I may or may not speak about. I have a child with Down syndrome." And I don't accept that it's using the community with Down syndrome. My godson, my nephew, has Down syndrome. I don't think that it's using these wonderful people, these wonderful loving people, to say and to recognise the fact that they are targeted with abortion laws in every country in which abortion is legal. We know that in the UK, for instance, 90% of babies who are diagnosed with Down syndrome in the womb are aborted. We know that 98% of babies diagnosed in the womb with Down syndrome are aborted in Denmark. And we know that that figure is 100% of babies. They don't have Down syndrome in Iceland. Disability doesn't have to be specifically listed as a ground for abortion for it to take place, at the scale it's happening in some jurisdictions. Disability isn't a ground for abortion in Germany, but yet Down syndrome babies, most of them, are aborted in that country too. You see very few. Once the right to life is abandoned, it should come as no surprise that the most vulnerable and the most dependent and the most needy human lives are the first to be discriminated against. A recent Amórach poll that the pro-life campaign did shows, very surprisingly to me, that only 10% of the Irish public are even faintly aware that so many babies diagnosed with Down syndrome are aborted in England. The government's proposal to repeal the Eighth Amendment is also a total betrayal of women. If the pro-repeal movement really trusted women, they'd be honest with them about what really happens to a baby during an abortion. Instead, the baby is written out of the picture. It's described as nothing more than a clump of cells, even though the baby's heart starts beating by 21 days. The only way the case for abortion can be sustained in society is through deep denial and euphemisms, words like choice, healthcare, that conceal what is actually being done. When people talk about the right to choose, it sounds good, but they never finish the sentence. To choose what? It's the right to choose to deliberately end the life of an innocent unborn baby. It is a significant human rights abuse of women to withhold from them vital information about the development of their unborn baby and the possible adverse mental health impact of abortion on them. This gives the lie to the pro-choice mantra that we are trusting women to make an informed decision on whether or not to proceed with an abortion. The clear lesson from the entire spectacle of the Citizens' Assembly and the Oireachtas, our parliamentary committee process, is that once one single unborn baby's life is regarded as undeserving of protection in our laws, it undermines the protection of every unborn baby. Legalised abortion is public policy in defiance of science. We either protect every human life in our laws or we end up protecting no one. And as an aside, I should say too, you may not know that one of our junior ministers and a Justice Committee of our Parliament are currently drafting the heads of a bill on assisted suicide. Be awake and talk, please. The recent government decision to opt for a time limit of 12 weeks on request was plucked out of thin air, and it shows a frightening disregard for the right to life. If you are not aware, if you don't understand the horror of what abortion actually is and does, then I would encourage you to go onto the internet and to look in particular at the evidence of the expert invited in by the committee, Dr. Peter Thompson, where he let his mask slip and he described, without thinking, I'm sure, of the impact on people like us, fair-minded people, certain abortion procedures which would occur if repeal were to happen, where the baby is first paralysed by the abortionist, who can then more easily inject poison into its heart to kill it. This is the barbaric reality of what repeal would actually mean, as opposed to the sanitised version we hear and read about every day in our media. We don't hear much about the women whose lives have been traumatised by abortion. We meet them. We meet them at all of our pro-life rallies and vigils. We are so thankful for groups like Women Hurt and for Rachel's Vineyard. There very likely are some of you here in the room with me. And I always say to you, if you are out there, please don't suffer. Please contact one of the groups where women who have been through what you are going through can help. We are not here to judge. We are called upon to love each other. And that is what all of us want to do. But we want to love every human member of our family, from conception to natural death. There's been a lot of talk in the media about very prominent politicians changing their minds in favour of backing a repeal of our Eighth Amendment, having looked and been convinced by the evidence of expert witnesses who presented at the Oireachtas Committee on the issue. Now, I'm not going to go back over the Citizens' Assembly, it would take too long, but it's important that we just look at the work of this parliamentary committee, which is going to inform government policy. At the outset, it invited, we're not sure how many, but it had 24 pro-repeal witnesses to present before it, and just 3 pro-life. And then, 3 weeks into the 12 weeks of their hearings, that committee voted not to retain the Eighth Amendment in full, which showed as a group that they had no interest in hearing from all of the witnesses before making their decision, and some of them might have made their minds up before the exercise had even begun. This move alone totally undermined the credibility of the committee and put to bed any idea that it was conducting itself in a fair and in an impartial way. Members of the committee, as our public paid representatives, had a duty to scrutinise and to ask hard and searching questions before voting on any proposal, most particularly a proposal that involves a life and death issue, as it does in this case. It finally seems to have dawned on some of the committee members how awful it looked to have voted for abortion before the hearings had even concluded and before they had heard all of the evidence. They scrambled late in the day to issue invitations to pro-life speakers in an attempt to gloss over the vote and the appallingly skewed lineup of speakers for the committee that they had invited. 5 pro-life speakers in total were invited by the committee as witnesses. 5. We don't know how many they invited who were pro-repeal of our pro-life law, but we know that they listened to 28 witnesses. So the next time you hear a politician saying he or she favours repeal based on what the experts said, keep in mind how ridiculously one-sided and undemocratic the entire process was from the beginning. Who were the experts they had on the repeal side? They were presented as independent experts. The reality is that many of them worked for outfits that provide abortion internationally, advocate for abortion rights or abortion services. For instance, we had the head of the British Pregnancy Advisory Service, the biggest abortion provider in the UK, speaking. She is currently advocating the decriminalisation of abortion where it still exists in England, just in certain cases, because she knows that once there is no sanction, no penalty, then that nothing in the Act can be insisted upon. We know that already when it comes to requiring a number of doctors to sign certificates that women can have abortions, they pre-sign them in advance with no patient's name on them. So it's essential that we don't forget this point, that the Dáil Committee listened to a who's who of the international pro-abortion movement, and that the evidence that they gave will be the basis for the proposal that we'll all be voting on in the referendum in May. course, the media describe the government's work on this as progressive and compassionate. But no amount of approving coverage can disguise the truth that with every abortion, a new, a unique, and unrepeatable human life with boundless potential loses the right to live. The right to live, the right to life, is supposed to be an inalienable right. Our Constitution doesn't give it or confer it. Our politicians cannot give it. Our Constitution simply acknowledges the right to life and promises to defend and vindicate it. In the coming weeks, it will become clearer and clearer what the government's proposal would lead to in practice, namely abortion on demand. This has been said by many eminent legal people. For instance, Professor Jerry White wrote this last year, that if the Eighth Amendment is removed, it will lead to abortion on demand. It doesn't matter what legislation comes immediately afterwards. To any extent that it restricts abortion, it can be said that it will move forward because there'll be nothing in our Constitution to limit it. As the public come to see this more and more, I'm confident that they will vote to keep our Eighth Amendment. They'll see that in the last 5 years, the government has worked very hard against it. They've had a government working group, 2 sets of Oireachtas hearings, legislation in 2013, 5 private members' bills in Parliament to introduce abortion, the Citizens' Assembly last year, more Oireachtas hearings in late 2017, and then the Oireachtas Committee's report. Not one of these democratic exercises explored any positive alternatives to abortion. The single focus throughout this period has been about paving the way for more abortion. Not even 1 hour was set aside in the hundreds and thousands of hours occupied by these exercises to listen to or consider the regret or support for families of babies diagnosed with life-limiting conditions. But we're being rushed in a referendum to strip away all protections from unborn babies, when only one side of the story has really been given a proper airing. The Eighth Amendment has had a hugely positive, humane, life-saving impact in our country. Our abortion rates are so much lower than in the UK. In the UK, 1 in 5 pregnancies ends in abortion. In Ireland, it's 1 in 20. And even if you allow for the figures that we can't quite know how accurate they are in relation to the abortion pill, we're still talking 1 in 13 here. 1 in 5 pregnancies in the UK ends in abortion. I think Jerry White has done in a talk last week a calculation of what abortion in similar terms to the UK would mean here, and he told how many more thousands than just over 3,000 we would have this year who would be having abortions. The other thing we have to consider, which hasn't been talked about much in the media, is that the kind of law that's being proposed here would allow abortion up to birth in certain circumstances. That seems to be what is being proposed. And we may very well have abortion tourism to Ireland, in the same way as it exists now in Europe, where some countries have more lenient laws and allow abortion in wider circumstances. People travel to avail of those laws. On any given night, there are more than 20 homeless pregnant women living on the streets of our cities. What is our government doing about that? Why are they trying to target the lives of unborn babies instead of supporting the lives of mothers in distress? In the same way, we should be looking to make Ireland a pioneering centre of excellence for perinatal palliative care, so that when babies who are given poor diagnosis when they are born arrive into their families, that the families are supported on the journey of life, however long or however short that baby's life may be. I don't have the note here, but my recollection is that in 2016, the HSE recognised that, I think there were, I'm good on figures, 3,804 children living in Ireland with life-limiting conditions, conditions from which they would die as infants or young people. 3,804. Should they not have been allowed to live? There is no agreed list of medical conditions which are seen universally as fatal. In every one of the examples that some doctors say are fatal, there have been babies who beat the odds. Some have lived for minutes, hours, weeks, and even for years with some of these syndromes. Ireland has always cherished life, sometimes perhaps not as much as it should, but we have welcomed life, and we have supported life, and we have supported life in our laws, and we have to continue to do this. In 2015, do you know how many children were presented for adoption in Ireland? Can I hear 3 people shout out a guess? Oh my goodness, you're actually pretty accurate. I thought people would have thought there were more. There were only 7. 7 babies available for hundreds of families who would like to adopt. We should be putting resources in place to conduct research with organisations like the Jérôme Lejeune Foundation to enhance the lives of children with Down syndrome, to improve their quality of life and their outcomes. We should be supporting organisations like Laura Lynn and Jack and Jill and all of the other foundations, Hughes House, people who are out there giving their time and their lives to looking after children who have these conditions and support the families who look after them. These are just some of the areas we should focus our energies on as a society, rather than for looking for the fatal option and following other countries down the road of abortion. The debate surrounding the entire Eighth Amendment presents 2 radically different visions of society and human rights. When a particular group of human beings is singled out as undeserving of legal protection, we undermine respect for all human life, born and unborn. Who's next? Who's next? You probably aren't aware of this, but in the Netherlands, for example, did you know that if you miss the problem that the baby has while you're pregnant, it is legal to have euthanasia on a newborn baby up to its first birthday in Holland, and then from the age of 12. There are no limits, no age limits on euthanasia in Belgium. And Holland was proposed one evening on a current affairs programme by Kate O'Connell as being a model that perhaps we could look to. I don't think so. St. John Paul the Great wrote so many times about the value of every human life. He told us this when he came to Ireland. He wrote in Evangelium Vitae, "It is impossible to further the common good without acknowledging and defending the right to life, upon which all the other inalienable rights of individuals are founded and from which they develop. Only respect for life can be the foundation and guarantee of the most precious and essential goods of society, such as democracy and peace." And last year, I listened to Pope Francis say, "The book of Genesis makes clear that each of us is a creature who is willed and loved by God for ourselves. We are not just a well-organized collection of cells passing through a process of evolution. As well, the whole of creation is included in God's special love for mankind that reaches all generations of mothers, fathers, and their children. Legalized abortion is part of the old order. It's not progressive. It's not modern. It has led to the deaths of millions of innocent unborn babies in over 40 years. There is nothing liberal, enlightened, or progressive about misusing words like choice or healthcare to sanction the taking of a human being's life. Once abortion is introduced, it's only a matter of time before the grounds are expanded. That is the international experience, and it is madness to think that Ireland would be any different. The campaigners for the repeal of our life equality protection in the Constitution, our Eighth Amendment, which protects the mother's right to life and the baby's right to life, but recognises that sometimes the mother might need treatment, which means the baby's chances of survival are slim or nil, but will always oblige the doctors to try to save 2 lives. The people who want to get this out know why they're doing it. They're doing it because they cannot expand the abortion law further. They can't have abortion for children with life-limiting conditions as long as the Eighth Amendment stays in the Constitution. One of their legal advisors is on record 2 years ago as saying that If, they say when, I say if, and it won't be, the Eighth Amendment is repealed, they foresee, and I quote, interim abortion legislation as a stopgap on the way to light touch or almost no regulation at all. That's what they want, and that's what they're not telling you. She continued to say something. Are there any Canadians here? Anybody been to Canada? Well, I might have to explain some of it. She continued to say, I would say confidently that you could have an Irish Morgan Taller if the Eighth Amendment weren't there. We have a liberal constitution with the odd bit of Catholicism lurking around the edges, and the Eighth Amendment is the strongest bit. Morgan Taller, for your information, was a Canadian doctor who, at the height of his success, ran a chain of 20 abortion clinics, and who was involved in taking 3 cases to the Supreme Court in Canada to expand the abortion laws there. Do we really want that kind of a scenario and profiteering of our babies? In the coming weeks, nothing should distract us or knock us off course in speaking up, speaking out, and defending the Eighth Amendment. We were not made to fit in with this agenda. We were made to stand out. The clamour, thank you. That's something I tell my children, and I hope you do too. You're not made to fit in, you're made to stand out. The clamour for repeal of the Eighth Amendment is clearly political and it's media-driven. We're not hearing it on the doorsteps. It's definitely not coming up from the grassroots. It's not the thing that is at the forefront of the voters' minds. It is the thing that is distracting people from things that the government should be doing and that they're not doing. It's a distraction. As pro-life supporters, we have to have one focus. We have less than 100 days. We must defend and safeguard the Eighth Amendment. We must. Because if we don't, we will be like these other countries. Please don't leave it to others to do all the work. You saw our friend Magnus from Argyll in Scotland, from a tiny village, a shy Highlander, and the impact he has had that 1 million children every day have food in their tummies. Each one of you can have a big impact. Now it's time for us to call our grannies, to call our relatives, to talk to our friends, to speak out for the Eighth Amendment. When people say to my children, have you got your repeal t-shirts? They're shocked when mine turn around and say, no, I'm pro-life. We need our young people not to be afraid, particularly in the universities that are crucibles for the repeal movement. The work that each one of us in this room does in the next few months will define the kind of Ireland our children and our grandchildren will grow up in. It will either be an Ireland that welcomes and protects life at all its stages, or an Ireland where the right to life is disregarded and where babies at their most fragile beginnings are deemed as unworthy of any meaningful protections in our law. Lives unworthy of life. Where have we heard that before? It echoes down the centuries, and particularly the early part of the 20th century. A dear friend of the pro-life movement, whose name was Patrick O'Dwyer, sadly died not too long ago. Sometimes Patrick used to stop by the pro-life campaign office after spending the day standing on the corner of O'Connell Street and Henry Street, quietly handing out pro-life literature in his own unobtrusive way. From time to time, he received jeers and insults and hurtful remarks from people who walked by. But one day he came into the office with a smile on his face from ear to ear about a meeting, an encounter that he had had earlier that day. A young woman approached him in the street, and she handed him her newborn baby to embrace. She told him that the baby he was holding was alive because of a leaflet he had handed her some months earlier. She said she was planning to abort her daughter and changed her mind after reading the simple little pro-life flyer. He was just overjoyed. He delighted in telling us that every insult, every jeer that he had endured on the streets for years was worth it 1,000 times over for that one single encounter with that young mother and the baby that she had had. So anytime you feel discouraged in the coming months, think of Patrick O'Dwyer. Think of the life-changing impact one pro-life leaflet or one word of kindness in the right place at the right time can have in helping to save a life. What an honour to be part of a movement where something awesome like this can happen. What an honour to look after babies and to help them. One of the things that I hadn't scripted, but it really moved me to become part of this entire movement, was having a baby when I was 7 months pregnant and spending months going in and out of a neonatal intensive care unit, helping her, bringing milk to feed her, seeing other babies struggling for their lives, innocent human lives, being nursed and kept warm and protected as best they could by nurses and doctors. And one of the things that affected me most was how one day a nurse I was speaking to beside the incubator looked at me, and with tears in her eyes, she said to me, "It's a privilege to nurse your daughter." And I just thought to myself, my heart burst, and I thought to myself, what an honour to have a vocation like that and to have a person like that looking after my child. That daughter is now an adult. Not all babies survive, but the nurses and the doctors who care don't want to kill. They're there to cure and help. Human rights never get old. They don't pass their sell-by date. They don't change. The right to life is inalienable. That means we can't give it away. We can't concede it to somebody else. A law can't give it to us. We have it. We have a right to life which laws should protect. And before I leave the platform here, and thank John so much for the opportunity and all of you, I want to invite you to visit the Pro-Life campaign stand at the next break, and I look forward to meeting you. There's lots of information. People will be really glad to meet you. There are an awful lot of things that you can do to help. And you'll recognize it. It's the stand with the pink and purple balloons. I want to thank, from the bottom of my heart, the organisers of this incredible event for inviting me to speak. I enjoy coming to it every year, and I'm very privileged to be invited to speak. I want to thank all of the other pro-life groups who are here also this weekend. We all know each other, and I thank them for all the incredible work they are doing too. And I particularly want to thank all of you who set time aside each day to pray for the pro-life cause, and particularly you who are involved, as I'm trying to be, in the 100 days of prayer. I think we need that as the fuel in our tanks, and I thank you for all that you're doing, praying for each of us and praying for the work that we do. I want to ask each one of you to please, please, please don't just sit here. If I ever asked you to do anything before, this time you must take the time in the next couple of months, it's not a long time, to do as much as you can to convince people to vote to keep our 8th Amendment. We will help you in any way that we can, and I hope that you'll all head to the stand with the pink and purple balloons. Thank you very much, and God bless you.
Thanks very much, Caroline. Well done. Thank you.
So well done, Caroline.